In the dying light of 1,000 burning worlds, when the greatest warriors of the galaxy kneel in defeat, when hope itself seems as distant as forgotten stars, there comes a moment of terrible revelation. It is not in victory that truth is revealed, but in the shadow of absolute destruction. For it is only when death whispers its final promise that the universe learns what sleeping giants it has awakened. They called them the youngest species. The weakest. The most naive children of a backwater world, stumbling into a cosmos already carved up by ancient empires and elder races who had mastered the stars when Earth was still cooling. But, in the end, as the most feared warrior in galactic history draws his last breath, he will speak words that will echo through eternity, words that will make every living being in the universe understand why you never, ever, underestimate the species that calls itself human. This is not a story of conquest. This is a story of awakening. This is the moment when the galaxy learned to fear the sound of a human heartbeat. The silence in the Galactic Council chambers was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that comes before avalanches, before supernovas, before the moment when everything familiar crumbles into dust. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat perfectly still in the human delegation's seat, her dark eyes scanning the assembled representatives of 47 star systems, each one avoiding her gaze like she carried some invisible plague. 3 months ago, she had been a diplomatic attaché on a peaceful trade mission. Today, she was the last human representative in known space, surrounded by beings who had just voted to classify her entire species as a galactic threat level Omega. The highest classification ever assigned to any sentient race. Higher than the Vorthack plague spreaders. Higher than the consumed ones who devoured planets for breakfast. Higher than the reality-bending chorus who could unmake matter with a thought. The vote had been unanimous. 47-0. Even their oldest allies had turned against them. High Chancellor Vexthera of the Dominion rose from her crystalline throne, her forearms spreading in a gesture that would have looked welcoming if not for the barely contained terror in her 6 compound eyes. She was old, older than most civilizations, and had personally witnessed the rise and fall of empires that existed before humans had even discovered fire. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of eons. The motion has been carried, she announced, her translator rendering her chittering speech into the common tongue. Effective immediately, humanity is declared a Category Omega threat to galactic stability. All human vessels are to be impounded. All human colonies are to be pacified. All human individuals are to be detained for the safety of the greater galactic community. Sarah finally stood, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the vast chamber. She was smaller than most beings present, standing barely 5.5 feet tall, her black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. By any measure, she looked completely unremarkable among the assembled dignitaries. Some had shells that could deflect plasma fire. Others had natural telepathic abilities that could crush minds. A few could manipulate gravity with their thoughts alone. Sarah Chen looked like she could be snapped in half by a gentle breeze. "Might I ask," she said, her voice steady and controlled, "what exactly humanity has done to warrant this classification?" A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Krallites, massive insectoid beings from the outer rim, clicked their mandibles nervously. The ethereal Luminari, beings of pure energy housed in crystalline shells, flickered with agitated light patterns. General Thakmarin of the hegemony stood next. He was built like a living mountain, his stone-like skin scarred from 1,000 battles, his 4 massive arms ending in claws that could rend starship hulls. He had personally conquered 17 systems and was widely considered the most dangerous individual in known space. When he spoke, lesser beings cowered. "Your species," he rumbled, his voice like grinding boulders, "has been operational in galactic space for only 47 standard years. In that time, you have participated in 6 major conflicts. Your win ratio is unprecedented. Statistically impossible. You have defeated enemies that should have crushed you without effort. Forces that have fought wars since before your species evolved have been outmaneuvered by creatures who learned to travel between stars within a single generation." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "And this is problematic?" "Problematic?" The word seemed to stick in the general's throat. "Your species fought the Krex hegemony to a standstill. The Kreks had never lost a war in 3,000 years. They had weaponry that could crack moons, genetic modifications that made them perfect killing machines, and tactical systems refined over millennia of constant warfare. Your people met them with kinetic projectiles and chemical explosives. Primitive weapons by any civilized standard. The Kreks, Sarah said quietly, were also slavers who made a habit of glassing inhabited worlds for sport. Someone had to stop them. The point, General Thokmarin continued, his voice growing louder, is that you did stop them. With inferior technology. With a military that had never fought a space war. With tactics that made no sense to any rational analysis. And then. He paused, and, for the first time since Sarah had known him, the unshakable general seemed uncertain. And then, there was Kepler 442b. The name hung in the air like a curse. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but, inside, she felt a familiar cold knot forming in her stomach. Kepler 442b. The battle that had changed everything. The moment when humanity had revealed something about itself that perhaps should have stayed hidden. The Devourers, whispered Representative Zethai of the Collective, her tentacle form shivering despite the chamber's warmth. 73 billion of them. They had consumed 47 systems. They were unstoppable. They had adapted to every weapon, every strategy, every defensive measure any species had ever developed. They were perfect. Sarah said nothing. Your species, Zethai continued, her voice barely audible through her translator, sent 12 ships. 12. Against an enemy that had defeated the combined fleets of the Core Worlds Alliance. Ships crewed by beings who had been alive longer than your species had existed. Weapons systems that had been perfected across geological timescales. Military traditions older than your planet's continents. Still, Sarah remained silent. Those 12 ships, General Thokmarin took over, destroyed the entire Devourer swarm. Not defeated. Destroyed. Completely. In 17 hours. There were no survivors on either side. When our investigation fleets arrived at the battle site, we found. He paused again, and Sarah realized that this mountain of a being, this legendary warrior who had faced down cosmic horrors without flinching, was genuinely disturbed by whatever memory he was accessing. We found nothing, he finished. Empty space. No debris. No energy signatures. No trace that billions of life forms had died there. The Devourers were simply gone. Along with your 12 ships and their crews. High Chancellor Vexthera stepped forward. Ambassador Chen, what happened at Kepler 442b? Sarah looked around the chamber, taking in the faces of beings she had worked with for 3 years. Beings she had shared meals with, laughed with, negotiated trade agreements with. Beings who now looked at her like she was some kind of monster wearing a friendly mask. The Devourers were heading for the Tau Ceti colony worlds, she said simply. 2 billion civilians. Mostly families. Children. The evacuation ships couldn't outrun the swarm. Someone had to buy them time. That does not answer the question, pressed the Chancellor. How did 12 human ships accomplish what the greatest military powers in the galaxy could not? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Outside the chamber's massive windows, she could see the lights of Nexus Station, the political heart of galactic civilization. Millions of beings from hundreds of species, all living and working together in the greatest achievement of interstellar cooperation in known history. All of them now afraid of her. We did what we had to do, she said finally. The chamber erupted. Voices raised in a dozen different languages, translators struggling to keep up with the flood of angry, frightened words. Several representatives stood, gesturing wildly. The luminari flickered so rapidly their shells looked like strobe lights. The Krallites' chittering rose to a fevered pitch. Chancellor Vexthera raised all 4 arms, calling for order. It took several minutes for the chaos to die down. Ambassador, she said once silence had returned, that answer is insufficient. The galactic community has a right to know what weapons your species possesses. What capabilities you have been hiding. The technology that allows a handful of primitive vessels to accomplish the impossible. Sarah looked directly at the Chancellor, her expression calm but, somehow infinitely sad. Chancellor Vexthera, with respect, you have just voted to classify my entire species as an Omega-level threat. You have authorized military action against human colonies where children are playing in schoolyards and families are sitting down to dinner. You have declared war on a species whose only crime was defending the innocent when no one else would. She gestured to the assembled representatives. You want to know what weapons we possess? You want to understand what makes humans dangerous? She paused, and, when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that made several beings step back involuntarily. You're about to find out. Before anyone could respond, the chamber's emergency alert system activated. Red lights began flashing, and a mechanical voice announced in the common tongue, "Priority emergency. All defensive positions to full alert. Unknown vessels detected at system perimeter." Admiral Corvith of the Nexus Defense Force materialized as a holographic projection in the center of the chamber. The grizzled Taurian officer's usually composed demeanor was cracked with barely contained panic. "High Chancellor, we have a problem. Multiple unidentified vessels have just translated into the system. They're not responding to hails and their energy signatures are unusual." "How many ships?" demanded the Chancellor. "We're still counting, but preliminary scans suggest approximately 2,000 vessels of unknown configuration. They're arranged in perfect formation and holding position at the system's edge." A chill ran through the chamber. 2,000 ships was more than the entire Nexus Defense Force. More than most sector fleets. If hostile, they could reduce the station to glowing particles within hours. "Visual contact?" asked General Fakmarin, already reaching for his personal weapons. "Affirmative. Putting it on main display now." The chamber's central holographic projector activated, showing a view of deep space near the system's outermost planets. There, arranged in precise geometric formations that spoke of military discipline, hung a fleet unlike anything the assembled representatives had ever seen. The ships were sleek and angular, their hulls a dark metallic gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were clearly built for war, bristling with weapon systems that had no recognizable configuration. Design analysis suggests these vessels are not of any known galactic architecture, Admiral Corvith continued, his image flickering with interference. "The energy patterns are consistent with. He stopped, his expression growing pale. "Admiral," prompted the Chancellor. "The energy patterns are consistent with human technology, but scaled up by orders of magnitude. Ma'am, if these are human vessels, they represent a level of military capability far beyond anything in our databases. Each of these ships appears to be significantly larger and more heavily armed than our own dreadnoughts." Sarah stood very still, her expression unreadable. Around her, the representatives of 47 worlds began to realize that perhaps they had made a very serious mistake. "They're moving," Admiral Corvith announced, his voice tight with fear. "All vessels are advancing toward the inner system. ETA to Nexus Station, 14 hours. High Chancellor Vexthera turned to Sarah, her compound eyes wide with something approaching desperation. "Ambassador Chen, if these are your people, you must contact them. Tell them to stand down. This station houses representatives from across the galaxy. Millions of innocent civilians." Sarah looked at the display, watching the orderly advance of the mysterious fleet. When she spoke, her voice was very quiet, but somehow it carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "You declared war on my species 37 minutes ago, Chancellor. You authorized military action against human colonies. You voted to detain or eliminate every human being in known space." She paused, her gaze never leaving the advancing ships. "Did you really think we wouldn't respond?" The chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of life support systems and the increasingly rapid beeping of proximity alarms. For the first time in the recorded history of galactic civilization, the beings who ruled the stars felt genuinely afraid. Outside, 2,000 ships continued their inexorable advance, and, somewhere in the depths of space, humanity was coming to collect its children. The war that would reshape the galaxy had begun, and nobody yet understood what they were truly fighting. The next 12 hours passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Ambassador Sarah Chen had been escorted to secure quarters under what the station commander politely called protective custody, though the energy barriers and armed guards made the true nature of her situation clear enough. Through the small viewport in her room, she could watch the approaching human fleet growing larger against the backdrop of stars, their dark hulls catching and devouring light like hungry shadows. In the station's command center, panic was setting in with the methodical precision of a plague. Admiral Corvette stood before the main tactical display, his four-armed frame rigid with tension as he watched the most sophisticated sensor arrays in known space struggle to penetrate the approaching ship's mysterious shielding. What they could detect made no sense according to any known principles of physics or engineering. "Report," he commanded, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the command center. Lieutenant Commander Reshtai, a young Krallite whose chitin still held the blue-green sheen of recent molting, looked up from her sensor station with compound eyes that reflected pure bewilderment. "Sir, the readings are inconsistent with any known technology. The ships appear to be generating their own gravitational fields, but not for propulsion. It's as if they're carrying pocket singularities as power sources." "That's impossible," interjected Chief Science Officer Vector, an elderly luminary whose crystalline form pulsed with agitated orange light. "The energy requirements alone would require the total energy output of a medium-sized star," Reshtai finished. "Yes, sir. That's what the readings suggest. Each ship is generating approximately 10 to the 15th watts of continuous power." Admiral Corvette felt his blood go cold. That was enough energy to power entire star systems. If the humans had somehow harnessed that kind of power for military purposes, the implications were staggering. "Weapons signatures?" "Unknown, sir. The ships are heavily armed, but we can't identify the specific systems. They're using some form of shielding that distorts our scans. What we can detect suggests energy weapons of unprecedented yield, kinetic systems that could accelerate projectiles to significant fractions of light speed, and..." She paused, mandibles clicking nervously. "And what appear to be reality distortion generators." The command center fell silent. Reality distortion technology was theoretical at best, the kind of science that existed only in the fever dreams of mad researchers and ancient legends about the precursor races. The idea that the humans, who had barely mastered interstellar travel, could possess such capabilities was beyond comprehension. "Estimated time to weapons range?" Corvette asked, though he already knew the answer would offer no comfort. "At current rate of approach, 9 hours and 43 minutes, sir." "But, sir..." Reshtai's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Their movement pattern suggests they could be here much sooner if they wanted to. They're deliberately maintaining a steady approach speed. It's as if they want us to have time to think about what's coming." In the depths of the station, word of the approaching fleet had spread through the civilian population like wildfire. Markets shut down as traders frantically tried to book passage on departing ships. Families huddled in their quarters, uncertain whether to pack their belongings or simply wait for whatever was coming. The usually bustling promenades and social areas had emptied, leaving only the soft hum of life support systems and the distant sound of children crying. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from the station's military personnel. These were beings who had served in conflicts across the galaxy, who had faced down cosmic horrors and stood firm against impossible odds. Now they moved through the corridors with the careful, quiet steps of soldiers who knew they were facing something beyond their understanding or ability to fight. In the diplomatic quarter, emergency sessions were being convened by every major power block in galactic space. The Hegemony's War Council had been in session for 6 hours, their massive stone-skinned generals arguing over tactical options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion: they were hopelessly outgunned. The collective's leadership had withdrawn into their mental communion, thousands of minds linked together in desperate search for some solution that their vast collective intelligence might provide. The Core Worlds Alliance had activated their emergency protocols and were already moving their fastest ships toward the Nexus system, though even their most optimistic projections put the first reinforcements at 36 hours away. Far too late to matter if the approaching fleet decided to turn hostile immediately. It was General Thokmarin who finally broke the paralysis that had gripped the station's leadership. The massive warrior stormed into the command center like a living avalanche, his scarred hide bearing the fresh marks where he had been testing his personal weapons against increasingly resilient targets. Behind him came a dozen of his most trusted officers, each one a legend in their own right. "Status report," he demanded, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. Admiral Corvith gestured to the main display, where the approaching fleet continued its steady advance. No change in their course or speed. They maintained communication silence despite repeated attempts at contact. "Our best analysis suggests we're facing a technological advantage of at least 3 orders of magnitude." Thakmaran studied the display with the eye of someone who had spent centuries evaluating military threats. What he saw there made his massive hands unconsciously curl into fists. These ships, they're not exploration vessels or cargo haulers converted for war. They were designed from the ground up as instruments of destruction. Look at the hull configurations, the weapon placement, the formation discipline. This is a military force that has seen real combat. "But, sir," interjected one of his officers, a lean Taurian whose cybernetic implants marked him as a veteran of the Outer Rim campaigns, "human military doctrine as we understand it relies on inferior numbers compensated by tactical innovation and individual initiative. These formations suggest a completely different approach. This is overwhelming force applied with surgical precision." The general nodded grimly. "Which means either we fundamentally misunderstood human capabilities, or something has changed since Kepler 442b. Something significant." 8 hours before estimated contact, High Chancellor Vexthera made the decision that would define the rest of her very long life. Against the advice of her security detail and the protests of half the Galactic Council, she walked alone to Sarah Chen's quarters and dismissed the guards. Sarah was standing at the viewport when the Chancellor entered, watching the approaching fleet with an expression of infinite sadness. She didn't turn around when the door sealed behind her visitor. "They're beautiful," Sarah said softly. "In a terrible way. Like watching a storm approach across an ocean. You know it's going to destroy everything in its path, but you can't help admiring the raw power of it." Chancellor Vexthera approached slowly, her forearms spread in the Dominion gesture for peaceful intentions. "Ambassador Chen, I come to you not as a representative of the Council, but as someone who has lived long enough to recognize when the universe is about to change forever." Sarah finally turned, and the Chancellor was struck by how young she looked. Humans lived such brief lives compared to most galactic species, and this one couldn't be more than 40 standard years old. A child by cosmic standards. And yet there was something in her dark eyes that spoke of knowledge far beyond her years. "The vote was unanimous," Sarah observed. 47 systems, representing hundreds of worlds and trillions of living beings, all agreeing that humanity needed to be eliminated. "I've been wondering what we did wrong. Where we went astray." "You saved the Tau Ceti colonies," the Chancellor said. 2 billion lives that would have been lost to the Devourers if your ships hadn't intervened." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "We saved them. And, in doing so, we revealed something about ourselves that apparently terrifies the entire galaxy." She gestured toward the approaching fleet. "Tell me, Chancellor, what do you see when you look at those ships?" Vexthera followed her gaze to the viewport. The fleet was close enough now that individual vessels could be distinguished, their dark hulls seeming to bend light around them in ways that hurt to look at directly. "I see the most advanced military force in known history. Technology that shouldn't be possible. Power that could reshape the galaxy." "No," Sarah said quietly. "You see what happens when you threaten our children." The Chancellor felt a chill run through her ancient bones. "Ambassador, please. Help me understand. Where did these ships come from? How did your species develop such capabilities without anyone knowing?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, her gaze never leaving the approaching fleet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made the Chancellor step back despite herself. "Do you know what humans were like before we reached the stars, Chancellor? Do you have any idea what kind of species produces beings capable of what happened at Kepler 442b? Your species fought wars," Vexthera replied carefully. "Most sentient races do during their primitive phases. It's considered a normal part of evolutionary development." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Wars. Yes, we fought wars. But that's like saying stars emit light. It's technically accurate but completely fails to capture the reality of the situation. She turned to face the Chancellor directly. In the last century before we achieved interstellar travel, humans killed 65 million of each other in a single conflict. We created weapons capable of ending all life on our planet and came within minutes of using them. We fought wars with poison gas, firebombs that could melt cities, and biological agents that could kill millions. The Chancellor's compound eyes widened. Such levels of self-destruction were almost unheard of among successful spacefaring species. Most civilizations either learned cooperation before achieving significant military technology, or they destroyed themselves entirely. But that's not the remarkable part, Sarah continued. The remarkable part is that we survived it. We learned to live with weapons that could end our entire species, and we chose not to use them. We developed the capability to destroy ourselves 1,000 times over, and, instead we reached for the stars. I don't understand, Vexthera admitted. Every human child grows up knowing that their species once stood on the brink of extinction by their own hand and chose to step back. Every human adult carries the genetic memory of ancestors who learned to fight wars that could literally end the world. We are a species that has looked into the abyss of total self-annihilation and chose to build starships instead. The Chancellor felt her breathing apparatus flutter with anxiety. What are you saying? Sarah returned her gaze to the viewport, where the approaching fleet had grown large enough that individual weapon emplacements could be seen bristling from their hulls like mechanical thorns. I'm saying that when the Galactic Council voted to classify humanity as an Omega-level threat, you made one critical error in your analysis. You assumed that what you saw at Kepler 442b represented the full extent of human military capability. It didn't? Sarah's reflection in the viewport smiled, and the Chancellor realized with growing horror that the expression held no warmth whatsoever. Chancellor, what you saw at Kepler 442b was 12 ships crewed by volunteers who knew they were going to die. Humans who accepted certain death to buy evacuation time for people they had never met. They went into battle carrying weapons we've had in storage for 300 years, using tactics we developed when our greatest enemies were other humans. The Chancellor's translator worked frantically to process what Sarah was saying, but the implications were so staggering that her mind refused to accept them. Storage? You're saying those weapons were obsolete? Museum pieces, Sarah confirmed. The kind of weapons we used to fight each other with before we learned better. Before we developed the tools we really needed to survive in a universe full of things like the Devourers. Outside the viewport, the lead ships of the approaching fleet had grown large enough that their true size was becoming apparent. They were enormous, each one easily the size of a space station, their dark hulls crackling with energies that made the Chancellor's natural electromagnetic senses scream warnings. Those ships out there, Sarah continued conversationally, were built after Kepler 442b. After we realized that our old weapons, the ones that could destroy planets and crack moons, weren't going to be sufficient for what we might face out here among the stars. They were built by a species that has spent 300 years learning to live with the power to destroy itself, and they were designed by beings who learned military strategy fighting opponents who shared the same capabilities. The Chancellor took another step backward, her forearms trembling with the effort to maintain composure. What do they want? Sarah finally turned away from the viewport, and the Chancellor saw that the young human ambassador was crying. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady and calm. They want their people back, Chancellor. Every human detained, every human threatened, every human colony marked for pacification. They want them returned, unharmed, with apologies and guarantees that nothing like this will ever happen again. And if we refuse? Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so simple and human that it somehow made what she said next even more terrifying. Then, the galaxy will learn why a species that nearly destroyed itself chose to reach for the stars instead. And, believe me, Chancellor, you really don't want that education. The human fleet stopped at the exact edge of weapons range, their dark ships hanging in space like predators that had decided to pause and savor the fear of their prey before the final strike. For 6 hours they maintained perfect formation, neither advancing nor retreating, their communication arrays silent except for the occasional burst of encrypted transmissions that the station's best cryptographers couldn't even begin to decode. It was General Thakmarin who finally requested permission to attempt direct communication. Standing in the command center surrounded by holographic displays showing tactical analyses that all reached the same hopeless conclusion, the massive warrior activated his personal communication suite and broadcast on all frequencies. "This is General Thakmarin of the Hegemony Defense Force, commanding officer of Nexus Station Military Operations. I request direct communication with the commanding officer of the approaching fleet." The silence that followed stretched for nearly an hour. Long enough for Thakmarin to begin wondering if the humans intended to simply wait them out, letting fear and uncertainty do their work for them. It would be an effective psychological tactic, he had to admit. The station's civilian population was already in near panic, and even his most experienced officers were showing signs of strain. When the reply finally came, it arrived not as a voice transmission but as a complete holographic projection that materialized in the center of the command center without any warning from the station's security systems. The figure that appeared was human, clearly female, wearing a uniform of midnight black that seemed to absorb light in the same way as the fleet's hulls. She was tall for a human, perhaps 6 feet in height, with silver gray hair pulled back in a severe military style. But it was her eyes that made every being in the command center take an involuntary step backward. They were the eyes of someone who had seen civilizations burn and made peace with the necessity of it. "I am Admiral Helena Voss, commanding the 1st Human Expeditionary Fleet," she said, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that came from decades of command in situations where hesitation meant death. "You have approximately 4 minutes to explain why you have declared war on the Human Confederacy and authorized military action against civilian populations." General Thakmarin, who had faced down cosmic horrors without flinching, found himself struggling to maintain his composure in the face of this human female who couldn't weigh more than 1/10 of his own mass. There was something in her bearing, in the way she stood perfectly still while radiating lethal intent, that triggered every predator recognition instinct his species had evolved over millions of years. "Admiral," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "there appears to have been a misunderstanding. The Galactic Council's classification of humanity as a threat level was intended as a precautionary measure following the events at Kepler 442b. The disappearance of an entire devourer swarm raised questions about human capabilities that the Council felt needed to be addressed through diplomatic channels." Admiral Voss listened to this explanation with the patience of someone watching an insect struggle in a web. When Thakmarin finished, she was silent for a moment before responding. "General, 47 star systems voted unanimously to authorize military action against human colonies. Civilian populations. Families. Children." Her voice never rose above conversational levels, but somehow each word hit like a physical blow. "Your diplomatic channels included detention facilities and what your own records classify as pacification protocols. Are you going to stand there and tell me that threatening to murder human children was a misunderstanding?" The command center had gone completely silent. Even the soft hum of electronic systems seemed muted, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Thakmarin realized that he was facing something he had never encountered in centuries of military service, an opponent who held all the advantages and had already decided that negotiation was a luxury they could not afford. "Admiral, please understand that the Council's actions were driven by fear. The weapon systems displayed at Kepler 442b represented capabilities far beyond anything in our previous assessments of human technology. The complete destruction of the devourer swarm without any apparent survivors suggested the existence of weapons of unprecedented destructive capacity." "Fear," Admiral Voss repeated, and, for the first time, something like emotion flickered across her features. "General, do you have children?" The question came so far out of nowhere that Thakmarin actually took a step backward. Yes. 3 offspring. And if someone threatened to kill your children because they were afraid of your species' military capabilities, how would you respond?" Thakmarin felt his 4 massive hands curl into fists without conscious thought. The idea of anyone threatening his offspring triggered reflexes that went back to the earliest days of his species' evolution. "I would destroy them," he said simply, the words coming out like grinding stones. Admiral Voss nodded as if he had just confirmed something she already knew. "The difference, General, is that we actually have the capability to do what you would want to do. Your council declared war on a species that has spent 3 centuries perfecting the art of warfare against opponents with equivalent destructive capabilities. You threatened our children. you authorized military action against civilian populations. And you did it because you were afraid of weapons you don't understand. She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show a tactical overview of the approaching human fleet. But now additional information was overlaying the display, information that made Admiral Corvatha's sensor readings look primitive by comparison. The true size of the ships became apparent, each one revealed to be a mobile fortress bristling with weapon systems that had no equivalent in galactic civilizations' databases. The ships you destroyed at Kepler 442b, Admiral Voss continued, were science vessels converted for emergency military action. Their crews were researchers and explorers who volunteered for what they knew was a suicide mission. They were equipped with defensive systems designed to protect against natural hazards during deep space exploration missions. She paused, letting this information sink in. Several beings in the command center had gone very pale as the implications became clear. The ships now surrounding your station are purpose-built instruments of warfare, designed and constructed by a species that learned military strategy fighting opponents who possessed weapons capable of ending entire worlds. Each vessel in this fleet carries enough firepower to sterilize a solar system. Each crew member has trained extensively in combat scenarios against enemies with equivalent capabilities. Admiral Corvath found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. How many ships? 2,437 vessels of the line, Admiral Voss replied without hesitation. Each one crewed by volunteers who had family members threatened by your council's declaration. Each one commanded by officers who have sworn blood oaths to ensure that humanity's children never again face the threat of genocide. The number hit the command center like a physical blow. The entire Nexus Defense Force consisted of fewer than 300 ships, and those were considered sufficient to defend the political center of galactic civilization against any conceivable threat. The idea that humanity possessed a fleet 8 times that size, composed of vessels that individually outgunned anything in known space, was so far beyond the scope of galactic military planning that it broke every strategic model they possessed. What do you want? General Thakmaran asked, his voice heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing that everything you thought you knew about the universe was wrong. I want Ambassador Saracen released immediately and transported to my flagship, Admiral Voss replied. I want every human being detained by Council authority returned to human space within 72 hours. I want formal apologies from every government that participated in the declaration of war against the Human Confederacy. And I want absolute guarantees that nothing like this will ever happen again. And if we refuse? The question came from Chancellor Vexthera, who had arrived in the command center just in time to hear the human admiral's demands. Admiral Voss turned her attention to the Dominion leader, and the Chancellor felt her compound eyes instinctively attempt to look away from the human's steady gaze. Chancellor, I served as a strategic planning officer during the Terran Consolidation Wars. I participated in military campaigns against opponents who possessed fusion weapons, quantum destabilizers, and reality warping technologies. I have personally commanded ships in battles where the wrong tactical decision could have resulted in the sterilization of entire star systems. She paused, and, when she continued, her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. If you refuse our demands, I will demonstrate to the galaxy exactly what kind of species you decided to declare war against. And, I promise you, Chancellor, that education will be far more expensive than compliance. Chancellor Vexthera felt her breathing apparatus flutter with barely controlled fear. In her very long life, she had negotiated with cosmic horrors, stared down reality-bending entities, and maintained diplomatic relations with beings whose thoughts operated on incomprehensible scales. But none of those experiences had prepared her for this moment, facing a human who spoke of planetary destruction with the casual certainty of someone discussing routine maintenance. Admiral, please understand that reversing the Council's decision will require time. There are procedures, protocols. You have 6 hours, Admiral Voss interrupted. After that, I will begin demonstrating human military capabilities on uninhabited systems throughout the galaxy. Starting with the Kepler 186 system and working my way toward more populated areas until your council decides that compliance is preferable to education. The holographic projection flickered and vanished, leaving the command center in stunned silence. Outside the station's viewports, the human fleet maintained its perfect formation, dark ships hanging in space like a promise of violence that the galaxy's greatest military minds were completely unprepared to face. It was Admiral Corvith who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chancellor, I respectfully recommend immediate compliance with all human demands." Chancellor Vexthera looked around the command center, taking in the faces of beings who represented the greatest military and scientific minds of galactic civilization. Every one of them wore the same expression of someone who had just realized they were standing on the edge of an abyss they hadn't known existed. "Do we have any choice?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. General Fakmarin, the most feared warrior in known space, slowly shook his massive head. "Chancellor, in 3 centuries of military service, I have never encountered an enemy that I believed could not be defeated through superior strategy, advanced technology, or overwhelming force. This is the first time I have ever recommended surrender before the first shot is fired." The Chancellor felt the weight of galactic history settling on her shoulders. In less than 24 hours, everything the civilized galaxy thought it knew about power, about warfare, about humanity itself, had been turned upside down. And, the most terrifying part was the growing realization that they still didn't truly understand what they were dealing with. Outside, 2,000 human warships waited with the patience of predators, and, somewhere among those dark hulls, beings who had learned warfare fighting opponents with weapons that could end worlds were preparing to teach the galaxy a lesson about what happened when you threatened their children. The education was about to begin, and nobody was ready for the curriculum. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in chaos and ended in something approaching terror. Representatives who had arrived expecting to manage a diplomatic crisis found themselves facing the possibility of galactic war against an enemy they had fundamentally misjudged. The debate, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours before the inevitable vote to comply with all human demands. But compliance, as it turned out, would not be enough. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the human flagship Retribution, watching through the massive viewports as the Nexus station grew smaller behind them. The transition from prisoner to honored guest had taken exactly 17 minutes once the Galactic Council's surrender had been transmitted. Now she found herself in the heart of the most advanced military vessel she had ever seen, surrounded by humans whose very presence seemed to radiate a kind of lethal competence that made her skin crawl. Admiral Voss approached from the central command station, her footsteps silent on the bridge's dark metal deck. "Ambassador, I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting. Your diplomatic work over the past 3 years has been exemplary, and you deserved better support from home." Sarah turned to face the Admiral, noting the way every crew member on the bridge moved with the fluid precision of someone who had trained extensively for combat in zero gravity. These were not the same kind of humans she had worked with in the diplomatic corps. These were something else entirely. "Admiral, may I ask where the rest of the fleet came from?" 3 years ago, the Human Confederacy's entire military consisted of maybe 200 ships, most of them converted cargo vessels and exploration craft. Admiral Voss was quiet for a moment, her gray eyes fixed on something far beyond the bridge's viewports. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memories that Sarah could only guess at. "The fleet has existed since the Treaty of Luna was signed in 2387. We've been building it in secret for almost 300 years, Ambassador. Every human colony, every research station, every deep space outpost has contributed to its construction and manning." 300 years? Sarah felt her mouth go dry. "But why? We didn't even know there was intelligent life beyond Earth until first contact 47 years ago." "No," the Admiral agreed. "But we knew there might be. And we knew that when we found it, we would need to be ready for anything." She gestured to one of her officers, who activated a holographic display showing the current positions of the human fleet. 2,000 ships arranged in formations that spoke of centuries of tactical refinement, each vessel bristling with weapons systems that had no equivalent in known galactic technology. The Consolidation Wars taught us that the most dangerous enemy is the one you don't see coming. When we finally achieved interstellar travel, we made a collective decision that humanity would never again be caught unprepared for conflict. Every ship in this fleet was built to fight opponents with capabilities equivalent to our own at full technological development. Sarah stared at the display, trying to process what she was hearing. "You built a fleet designed to fight humans?" "We built a fleet designed to fight anyone, Ambassador. But, yes, the baseline assumption was that our enemies would possess weapons equivalent to what Earth's various nations had developed by the end of the Consolidation Wars. Fusion weapons, quantum destabilizers, reality manipulation technology, planet crackers. Admiral Voss paused, and her expression grew distant. We assumed that any species capable of interstellar travel would have access to weapons at least as destructive as the ones we developed fighting each other. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Humanity had spent 3 centuries preparing for interstellar war against opponents who possessed Earth-level military technology. When they finally encountered other species, they found civilizations that had never developed anything approaching human destructive capabilities. The galaxy's greatest weapons were toys compared to what humans considered basic military equipment. The Kepler 442b incident, Sarah said slowly, that was just the beginning, wasn't it? Admiral Voss nodded grimly. 12 volunteer crews using weapons from our emergency stockpiles. Equipment we hadn't used in active service for over a century. They destroyed the Devourers so completely because those weapons were designed to fight opponents who could have rebuilt from molecular-level remains. Overkill was built into the basic design philosophy. Before Sarah could respond, the bridge's communication system activated with a priority alert. The image of a young human lieutenant appeared on the main display, his face flushed with excitement. Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the Hegemony Defense Command. General Thakmarin is requesting permission to come aboard. Admiral Voss raised an eyebrow. The general wants to visit us personally? Yes, ma'am. He's requesting safe passage for a single shuttle. Says he wants to understand what the galaxy is really dealing with before things go any further. Sarah found herself impressed despite everything. Whatever else could be said about the massive hegemony warrior, he had the courage to face his fears directly. Admiral, if I may suggest, General Thakmarin is genuinely trying to prevent a war. He's not like the others on the council. He might be someone we can work with. Admiral Voss considered this for a moment. Very well. Grant him safe passage. Escort him to Conference Room Alpha when he arrives. 30 minutes later, General Thakmarin stood in the corridor outside Conference Room Alpha, flanked by 2 human marines who looked like children beside his massive stone-skinned bulk. Despite their size difference, there was something about the humans' bearing that made it clear who was really in control of the situation. They moved with the fluid readiness of predators, and the general's trained eye could see weapons concealed beneath their uniforms that he couldn't identify. The conference room itself was a study in understated functionality. No decorations, no displays of wealth or power, just a simple table surrounded by chairs and wall-mounted screens that could display tactical information. Admiral Voss and Ambassador Chen were already seated, and the general noted that both humans maintained perfect posture despite appearing completely relaxed. General Thakmarin, Admiral Voss said as he entered, "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." The massive warrior lowered himself carefully into a chair that had been reinforced to support his weight, his forearms settling into a position that his species used for formal negotiations. Admiral, I come seeking understanding. In 3 centuries of military service, I have never encountered an opponent that I could not at least theoretically defeat. I need to know what the hegemony is truly facing. Admiral Voss studied him for a moment, and the general had the uncomfortable feeling that she was evaluating his worth as both an opponent and a potential ally. General, what do you know about human military history? Very little, he admitted. Our intelligence services focused primarily on human technological capabilities and population distribution. We assumed that any species capable of interstellar travel would have left their primitive warfare behind. That, Admiral Voss said with something that might have been amusement, was your first mistake. Ambassador Chen, would you mind providing the general with some context? Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. General, by the time humans achieved interstellar travel, we had spent approximately 4,000 years in a state of continuous warfare. Our species developed agriculture, writing, mathematics, and metallurgy primarily as tools for conducting more effective military campaigns. We learned to split the atom because we wanted more powerful weapons. We mastered genetic engineering because we wanted better soldiers. General Thakmarin felt a chill run through his massive frame. Continuous warfare? For 4 millennia? Wars of conquest, wars of ideology, wars of resources, wars of survival, Sarah continued. By the time we reached the stars, human beings had developed military doctrine for fighting in every conceivable environment against every conceivable type of opponent. We had weapons designed to fight in space, underwater, underground, in alternate dimensions, and inside the cores of stars. The Consolidation Wars, Admiral Voss added, were humanity's final major conflict. Earth's various nations had developed weapons capable of destroying planets, manipulating reality at the quantum level, and rewriting the laws of physics in localized areas. The war lasted 17 years and ended not because one side won, but because everyone involved realized that continuing would result in the literal destruction of the universe. The general's translator was working frantically to process concepts that had no equivalent in his own language. You're saying that humans developed weapons that could destroy reality itself? We developed weapons that made destroying reality a tactical possibility, Admiral Voss corrected. And then, we made the collective decision never to use them again. The Treaty of Luna established the Human Confederacy and outlawed research into weapons of universal destruction. But we kept everything else. She gestured, and the room's wall screens activated to display technical specifications for human military hardware. General Thakmarin found himself looking at weapon systems that operated on principles he couldn't even understand, much less counter. Quantum disruptors that can unmake matter at the subatomic level, Admiral Voss explained, pointing to various displays. Reality anchors that prevent opponents from using physics manipulation weapons. Temporal displacement systems that can remove targets from the timeline entirely. Consciousness disintegrators that can kill beings composed of pure energy. Dimensional destabilizers that can banish enemies to pocket universes where the laws of physics don't function. With each item on the list, General Thakmarin felt his understanding of galactic military balance crumble a little more. These weren't just advanced weapons, they were instruments of destruction that operated on scales he had never imagined possible. And every ship in your fleet carries these weapons? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. Every ship, General. Along with defensive systems designed to protect against equivalent weapons used by enemy forces. Our shields can deflect reality manipulation attacks. Our hull armor is designed to remain coherent even when the fundamental forces of physics are being altered in local space. Our crews are trained to fight battles where the enemy might be using weapons that make our ships exist in 17 different dimensions simultaneously. The silence that followed stretched for several minutes as General Thakmarin tried to process what he was learning. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something approaching despair. Admiral, the Galactic Council declared war on your species because 12 ships destroyed the Devourers in a way that seemed impossible. But, those 12 ships, they were using your obsolete equipment? Museum pieces, Admiral Voss confirmed. The kind of weapons we used to fight each other with before we learned better. General Thakmarin closed all four of his eyes, feeling the weight of his species' mortality settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. What do you want from us, Admiral? What does humanity require to avoid demonstrating these capabilities on populated systems? Admiral Voss leaned back in her chair, and, for the first time since the general had met her, she looked genuinely tired. General, we want what we've always wanted. To explore the galaxy, to learn from other species, to contribute to the greater galactic community. We want to trade, to share knowledge, to build something better together. She paused, and, when she continued, there was steel in her voice. But, we will not tolerate threats against human civilians. We will not accept military action against our colonies. And, we will not allow fear of our capabilities to be used as justification for genocide. What happens now? The general asked. Admiral Voss stood, moving to the conference room's viewport where the lights of Nexus Station could be seen in the distance. Now, General, you return to your people and explain what you've learned. You tell them that humanity has no interest in conquest or domination, but that we are fully prepared to defend ourselves against any threat. You explain that the weapons we used at Kepler 442b represent a tiny fraction of our actual capabilities, and that forcing us to demonstrate our full military potential would be unfortunate for everyone involved. General Thakmarin rose from his chair, his massive frame moving with the careful deliberation of someone who had just learned that everything he thought he knew about the universe was wrong. And, if some members of the Council refuse to accept this? If they decide that humanity must be eliminated regardless of the cost? Admiral Voss turned from the viewport, and the general saw in her eyes the same terrible certainty he had heard in her voice during their first communication. Then, they will learn why a species that nearly destroyed itself chose to reach for the stars instead of embracing extinction. As General Thakmaran was escorted back to his shuttle, he carried with him the knowledge that would reshape galactic civilization. Humanity was not the young, naive species that had stumbled into interstellar politics 47 years ago. They were the inheritors of 4,000 years of continuous warfare, possessors of weapons that could unmake reality itself, and they had been preparing for galactic conflict since before they knew there were other species to fight. The galaxy was about to learn what it meant to threaten the children of a species that had learned to wage war among the stars. 6 months after the Nexus incident, as historians would later call it, the galaxy had settled into an uneasy new reality. The human fleet had withdrawn to the edges of occupied space, maintaining a respectful distance from major population centers while making their presence unmistakably clear to anyone who bothered to scan the outer system territories. Trade resumed, diplomatic relations were cautiously re-established, and the various species of galactic civilization tried very hard to pretend that they had not collectively soiled themselves when confronted with humanity's true nature. But some wounds take longer to heal than others, and some lessons require more than 6 months to fully understand. General Thakmaran stood in the observation deck of his personal flagship, the Unyielding Stone, watching the approach of a single human vessel. It was smaller than the warships he had seen at Nexus Station, its hull bearing the simple design aesthetic that marked it as a diplomatic courier. But even this modest ship radiated the same subtle menace as the rest of the human fleet, the unmistakable signature of technology designed by beings who had learned warfare fighting opponents with equivalent destructive capabilities. The past 6 months had been the most challenging of Thakmaran's very long military career. Upon his return from the human flagship, he had been tasked with completely restructuring the hegemony's military doctrine to account for the existence of an ally whose casual defensive capabilities exceeded their most advanced offensive systems. It was like being asked to redesign a knife to work alongside a fusion reactor. But, more than the military implications, it was the philosophical questions that kept him awake during his rest periods. How did a species develop such destructive capabilities without destroying itself? How did they maintain the discipline to never use their most powerful weapons? And, most importantly, what did it mean for the galaxy that such beings existed? The human courier ship docked with minimal fanfare, and, within minutes, Ambassador Sarah Chen was being escorted to his private quarters. She looked exactly as he remembered her from that day in the Galactic Council chambers, still small and, seemingly fragile by the standards of most species. But, now he understood that her apparent vulnerability was as much an illusion as a paper tiger with nuclear teeth. "General," she said as she entered, offering the small bow that humans used as a formal greeting. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know relations between our species are still delicate." Thakmaran gestured for her to take a seat, noting how she moved with the same fluid readiness he had observed in the human Marines. Even their diplomats were warriors, he realized. Even their most peaceful representatives carried themselves like beings trained for combat. "Ambassador," he replied, settling his massive bulk into a chair designed to support his stone-like frame, "I must admit that your request for a private meeting has generated considerable curiosity among my staff. What brings humanity's chief diplomatic representative to the edge of hegemony space?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made the general slightly uncomfortable. When she spoke, her voice carried a sadness that he hadn't expected. "General, do you know what happened to the crews of those 12 ships at Kepler 442b? The question caught him off guard. "They died, presumably. Along with the devourers they destroyed." "No," Sarah said softly. "They didn't die, General. They chose to activate weapons that they knew would erase them from existence entirely. Not just death, but complete removal from the universe. No afterlife, no legacy, no memory. They chose to stop existing so that the Tau Ceti colonies would have time to evacuate." Thakmaran felt his 4 massive hands curl into unconscious fists. The concept of voluntary non-existence was so alien to his warrior culture that his mind struggled to process it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Sarah continued, "in the 6 months since Nexus Station, 17 more human ships have made the same choice. Ships that encountered threats to civilian populations in various parts of the galaxy. Pirates, slavers, reality cultists who wanted to use inhabited systems for their experiments. In each case, human volunteers chose complete erasure rather than allow innocents to be harmed. The general's translator worked frantically as his mind tried to comprehend what she was saying. 17 ships. Potentially thousands of crew members, all choosing non-existence to protect people they had never met, would never meet, whose names they didn't even know. This troubles you, he observed, noting the expression on the ambassador's face. It terrifies me, Sarah admitted. Not the sacrifice itself, but what it represents. General, my species has developed the capability to wage war on scales that could unmake reality itself. We possess weapons that could sterilize the galaxy, defensive systems that could survive the heat death of the universe, and the military doctrine to use all of it effectively. But our greatest strength, our most dangerous capability, isn't technological. She paused, and, when she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper. Our greatest weapon is that we will choose non-existence before we allow evil to triumph. Every human knows this about every other human. It makes us incredibly difficult to defeat, but it also means that we're constantly one decision away from removing ourselves from the universe entirely if we decide the cost of continuing is too high. General Thakmarin felt a chill run through his stone-like hide. The implications were staggering. A species with reality-ending weapons whose ultimate military doctrine was suicide rather than surrender. No wonder the human fleet had made every military strategist in the galaxy panic. Why are you telling me this, Ambassador? Sarah stood and moved to the observation port, where the lights of the general's fleet could be seen stretching away into the darkness of space. Because 6 months ago, the Galactic Council declared war on my species out of fear. And I'm afraid that fear might drive them to make an even worse decision. Worse how? There are some in the Council who believe that humanity's capabilities make us too dangerous to exist. They're developing plans to eliminate us entirely, reasoning that the risk we represent outweighs any benefits of coexistence. Sarah turned back to face him, and the general saw in her eyes the same terrible certainty he had witnessed in Admiral Voss. They don't understand that forcing humanity to make that kind of choice won't end the way they think it will. The general felt his breathing apparatus flutter with anxiety. You're saying that if the Council attempts to destroy humanity, your species will. We'll do what we've always done when faced with impossible odds, General. We'll take our enemies with us. Sarah returned to her chair, her movements precise and controlled. The difference is that this time, taking our enemies with us might involve weapons that could damage the fundamental structure of reality itself. Thakmarin closed all 4 of his eyes, feeling the weight of galactic history settling on his shoulders. How do we prevent this? That depends, Sarah said, on whether the galaxy is capable of learning to live with beings like us. General, humans don't want to rule the galaxy. We don't want to conquer other species or impose our will on galactic civilization. We just want to exist, to explore, to contribute to something greater than ourselves. She paused, and her expression grew distant. But we've spent 4,000 years learning that the universe is full of beings who will mistake kindness for weakness, who will interpret restraint as vulnerability. We've learned that sometimes, the only way to protect the innocent is to make it absolutely clear that threatening them will result in consequences that no sane being would accept. The general opened his eyes and studied the small human sitting across from him. In the months since Nexus Station, he had read every piece of human literature that had been translated into the common tongue, studied every historical document that had been made available to the galactic academic community. What he had learned had shaken his understanding of warfare, of civilization, of what it meant to be a sentient being in a dangerous universe. Ambassador, there is something I must tell you, he said finally. Something I learned during my years fighting on the Outer Rim, in battles against enemies that defied rational understanding. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her attention focused with laser intensity. I am old, Ambassador. Older than most star systems. I have fought wars across the galaxy, faced opponents that could manipulate reality, commanded fleets against enemies that existed partially outside normal spacetime. In all those centuries of combat, I learned one fundamental truth about warfare. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most powerful weapons. It is not the one with the largest fleet, or the most advanced technology, or the most brilliant tactical minds. Then, what is it? General Thokmarin looked directly at her, his ancient eyes reflecting the wisdom of countless battles fought across the stars. The most dangerous enemy is the one who has already accepted that they might lose everything, and decided that some things are worth that price. Sarah was very quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of species memory, of 4,000 years of warfare, of the knowledge that her people had nearly destroyed themselves and chose instead to reach for the stars. General, what happens when that enemy also possesses weapons that could end the universe? The old warrior was silent for several heartbeats, contemplating a question that had no good answer. Finally, he spoke, and his words would echo through galactic history for generations to come. Then, you pray to whatever gods you believe in that you never force them to make that choice. Because if you do, the last thing you will hear before the universe ends is the sound of a human saying goodbye. Outside the observation port, the lights of two fleets hung in the darkness between the stars. One belonged to a species that had ruled space for millennia, masters of conventional warfare and traditional military doctrine. The other belonged to beings who had learned to fight wars that could literally end everything, and who had somehow found the wisdom not to. Somewhere in that darkness, the future of galactic civilization hung in the balance, waiting to see whether the galaxy could learn to coexist with beings whose greatest strength was their willingness to choose non-existence rather than allow evil to triumph. The universe held its breath, and, in the silence between the stars, the echo of an ancient human prayer drifted on solar winds. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It was a prayer that the galaxy was about to learn by heart, because in the end, that wisdom was all that stood between civilization and the abyss of choices that no one should ever have to make. Before your final breath, the elder alien warrior had said, know what humans truly are. Now, at last, the galaxy was beginning to understand.